Lil Durk update. The trial has been pushed to August 2026. If you listen to the noise, all you're going to hear is Durk is cooked. Nobody's there for Durk. Motion denied. But that's just the noise. The fact of the matter is his trial team has won a number of points in this case. The indictments, there's been 3 indictments, and each time the allegations against Durk have thinned out. Some of the evidence that they wanted to use has actually been withdrawn so that the judge didn't have to exclude it. I'm going to take you through it piece by piece. I'll leave the best parts for the end. First, when they charged Durk, the main allegation about him rapping in his lyrics was this lyric about him going, told me they got an Addy, got location, green light, seen your son on the news screaming, no, no. Okay, that lyric, if you play that lyric, then you play the video of Quando next to the murdered victim, no, no, you would have won major points with a jury. That lyric's not in the indictment anymore because Findling showed that those lyrics were written well before the murder. Couple more points. When they bought this case, they said the conspiracy started in August 2022. That's when Durk arranged to get these rentals, these flights. That's when he made arrangements for the bounty. Then they switched that and they said, actually, the conspiracy started back when Von died in November 2020. And they had to do that because they needed to bring in more lyrics. They needed to bring in Instagram comments and the podcast comments to build that whole story because it wasn't enough to just show him paying shooters and show him renting cars. Maybe they're not going to be able to show all that. Let's extend it back. Let's give the jury a bigger story. They withdrew evidence of a 2022 incident in Chicago, which appears to have been them wanting to show that, hey, look, another time in Chicago back in 2022, he paid for people to go do violence. Well, they took that off the table and they said, hey, we're not going to talk about any of that. And here's the big one. When they charged Durk, they said in the indictment about the bounty that at the direction of defendant Durk Banks, defendant Wilson, that's OTF Didi, would pay the bounty or monetary reward to the shooters. That's gone. We know OTF Didi Wilson is going to trial. So their main allegation on the bounty that Durk told Didi to pay the shooters is gone, and they're pivoting to another way to prove the bounty. What did they pivot to? They say the consideration, the thing Durk promised for the murder, was lucrative music opportunities with OTF, putting people in videos. That's their theory of the bounty payment. That is where you make your defense. The murder for hire statute requires quid pro quo. The murder has to be committed in exchange for something of economic value, not an after-the-fact gift, not something that you would have just happened anyway, not something you do normally as part of your business, an actual contract. Okay, and if all the government can do is point out that the shooters were in the music videos after the fact, a jury has a real question to answer about that was a murder contract or just some other part of a relationship between a lot of people who were connected in a lot of ways. Interestingly, at the same time that the government pivoted from saying Didi paid the shooters to saying, hey, it was putting people in music videos, they also added a fallback charge. So when they bought the case, the original indictment, there was no stalking charge. In the second superseding indictment against Durk, they added a stalking charge. And the stalking charge is important because it doesn't require any contract. No quid pro quo, no bounty, no payment theory. You can add that charge and simply prove that, hey, he was telling people to go do this. He didn't necessarily pay them to go do a murder, but he was telling them to go follow that guy. He was telling them to go stalk that guy. And a jury can look at it and say, a lot like in the Diddy case, that, hey, not exactly sure here. Very, very, very suspicious individual over here. I'm going to go ahead and hit him with the lesser charge. And so, when the government puts in that fallback charge later in the case, that tells you that they're not 100% sure on their theory, that they acknowledge that, hey, we need to have a fallback here. Keep an eye out for a couple things. One, the motion for an anonymous jury is still hanging out there. That means that the jurors go in there and their identities and names and addresses are not revealed. If that motion gets granted, it's going to change the complexion of this case significantly, because if you're a juror and you go in there and the judge tells you, hey, we're going to keep everything confidential and your identity secret because this is a dangerous case, well, you might rule a certain way based on hearing that information. The other thing to keep an eye out for, not all of the lyrics have been ruled on. A lot of the lyrics, especially those lyrics that have to do with bounties, the judge said, hey, we get to closer to trial and I see how the government is going to try to prove a bounty. That's when I'll decide whether these lyrics about bounties are relevant. One thing to keep it a buck and just to not sugarcoat it, the lyrics that Durk has out there about slide for Vaughn, I got it back in blood, you just don't know, that's how it's supposed to be. The podcast comments about I just don't be hearing those comments anymore about sliding for Vaughn. All that stuff is in. All that stuff is incredibly damaging to Durk. Had those things not been released into the public record, my God, this would be a much easier case to defend. All that being said, Durk trial, August 2026. This will be a trial for the ages.